Professor Emil Farooqi and Dr. Shruti Kapila. So I would request Faisal to carry forward.
Thank you very much, Amit. So let's begin right away because, of course, we've started a bit late. As you can see from the schedule, we'll begin with Michael Dodson, who's speaking on transactional colonialism and knowledge of place, and then move on to Shruti Kapila and Emil Farooqi. Michael.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you to Amit very much for inviting me to come to speak. So in today's talk, I'll be drawing on my forthcoming book, which is called The City in Paper, or potentially The City on Paper. We haven't decided yet, which will be released in the spring of this year or next year. It's a study of the interaction through forms of colonial bureaucracy in North India, and the relationship that such interaction has to the creation of knowledge of place and of belonging to place, what I think of as a kind of partisanship on behalf of the city. At its most simple, this is a book that rejects notions of bureaucracy as staid and conservative and instead sees it as a creative force, even if that creativity is not strictly a part of the intention of its design. Michael Hertzfeld asked at the outset of his discussion of bureaucracy, the social production of indifference, who makes the self, the citizen or the state? To this question, I will add, who makes the city, and who determines what it means to live there? The city is, in important ways, an extension and reflection of the self, and in its making, the self is also remade. I'll begin today with 3 vignettes of everyday complaint and negotiation, all of them drawn from the local records of the commissioner of the Benares division, and all set in the city of Benares around the turn of the 20th century. These are 3 stories of bureaucracy and the mundane. Mostly a historian would ignore them when thumbing through the files in Benares' regional archive. For those archives contain all sorts of interesting accounts of riots, revenue policy, prostitution, irrigation, and infrastructure projects. These are mundane stories, as I've said, and not just in the sense that they're kind of boring, but in the sense that they are worldly, that is, related to the material world. And in the history of Benares, this is a particularly important thing, I think. And if you would like, I can unpack that sentence later. They are stories that are representative of the vast bulk of the work of the colonial state's bureaucracy, I think. They are not in any way extraordinary. And in this respect especially, they are important. They tell us about the small but meaningful things of life, the paying of taxes for services provided by the state, how one makes a living in a world that is rapidly changing, the routine maintenance of a public building used for worship. And so these stories also tell us about how people think of place and their own role in its making. So the first story. In the summer of 1902, a bather was drowned in the river Ganga after stepping off a takhta into deep water. A takhta is a wooden platform that extends off the end of the ghat into the river. It's mostly intended to help pilgrims, in particular, into and out of the water when performing ritual and ablutions. Shortly after this person's death, and this person is referred to as Ramdas in one document, the colonial state identified takhtas as inherently dangerous. And the deputy superintendent of police ordered their removal in the interest of public safety. Ghatiyas, however, the men who work as assistants to pilgrims in their bathing rituals, objected, concerned that the order would substantially interfere with their ability to make a living from the pilgrimage trade. The dispute was quickly resolved, however. After a meeting between the police and the leader of the Ghatiyas, a compromise was struck. The takhtas would be returned to their original positions, but permanent signs in Hindi would be put up warning pilgrims of the dangers of their use. All seems to have worked out for the best, and it only took a few days' time. The Kashi Sujin Samaj, an association of the good people of Benares, however, didn't get the memo about the Ghatiyas' agreement with the deputy superintendent of police, and so petitioned the commissioner's office asking that the ban on takhtas be reversed on account of it causing great upset and distress amongst the Ghathiya community. Chaman Lal, the Samaj's chairman, claimed moreover that the move had also caused inconvenience and uneasiness amongst the whole Hindu population of the city, which regularly made use of takhtas for their rituals. The commissioner's office was not amused with the intervention, however, not least as it was accompanied by a court filing seeking a reversal on the ban. The commissioner directed the deputy superintendent, to go back to the Ghats and make inquiries with the Gatiyas. Would they abide by their previous agreement? Duly dispatched, he successfully confirmed arrangements with the Gatiya community, the lawsuit was dismissed, and the commissioner's office duly ignored the Samaj's petition. The second vignette I'd like to share also involves the Kashi Sujin Samaj. The origins of this organization lie with a huge uptick in neighborhood civic activity in Benares during the 1880s. This is the time when the municipal board started to plan and build an ambitious water supply and sewerage scheme, which necessitated not only a good bit of land appropriation, but also a range of new and enhanced forms of taxation to pay for all of it. This was an infrastructure project deeply imbued with the trappings of modernity. Science, technology, and engineering were component parts of the colonial state's effort to revise the sanitary character of Benares and to hold it up as an emblem of the benefits of colonial rule. Benares would move from filth to fabulous, in other words, just like today. And here I should explain that while the municipal board was not a part of the colonial government per se, it was at this time tightly controlled by the commissioner's office through the magistrate, who was very often the board's chairman. So I'm simplifying matters here a little bit. In the early 1890s, the board was in the process of introducing and enforcing an entirely new set of rules for the distribution of a centralized water supply. This included rules for how to access the water rate, how to assess the water rate, which is the general tax for the provision of water, how to hook up water connections to houses, and how to monitor water usage. The Kashi Sujin Samaj had been a vocal advocate against new forms of municipal taxation in the city throughout the previous decade, claiming, for example, that Banarsis were all impoverished religious people and not commercially minded, and thus unable to bear the burden of new taxation. The Samaj was also vocally in favor of gradual, not radical change in the city, calling for the slow introduction of new technologies rather than vast citywide transformations. They were, in essence, a voice of conservatism. In 1893, the board decided to limit domestic consumption of city-supplied water under the water rate to 2,000 gallons per household per rupee in tax paid. In response, the Kashi Sujin Samaj, in a petition that was unusually sarcastic, even for them, noted that the policy was as defective as everything else that the board attempted to do. The Samaj noted that ordinary people had no idea how much volume a gallon contained. Only drunkards and liquor dealers knew such things. Hindus were also used to bathing several times a day and using water freely, as it was a gift of nature. And so the notion of limiting water to a set amount would be a difficult adjustment in traditional behavior. If, as I tend to think, the municipal board was seeking to reduce or eliminate negotiation with the city's populace through forms of standardization in tax rates and rules, they were nevertheless consistently drawn into just this sort of discussion at regular intervals. Needless to say, whenever such issues were raised with the board, they also often made their way to the magistrate and to the commissioner, who were themselves drawn into the fray. For my third small story, we will leave the Kashi Sujin Samaj behind and move to a different community in a neighborhood far from the luxuries of the wealthier, more established neighborhoods near the Ghats. In Adampura, in the far north of Benares, the population is predominantly Muslim and predominantly poor. And in the midst of this part of the city is a mosque. The Arha Kangura Masjid dates to the 15th century and is built in a monumental Sharqi style. Austere, simple, and yet decorated with delicately carved features, it is wholly unique in Benares, and rivaled only for its architectural importance by the Sharqi mosques in Jaunpur itself. In 1916, J.A. Page, Superintendent of Archaeology in the United Provinces, wrote an inspection note on this mosque, formally recommending it for conservation and protection by the imperial government under Act 7 of 1904, the Ancient Monuments Preservation Act. Page recognized the historical value of the mosque by reference to its Sharqi origin. Closer, okay. But complained that the structure had been badly damaged by repeated applications of whitewash. Page recommended that the government enter into negotiations with the caretaker of the mosque and seek to both remove the whitewash and other modern artifacts, the clock, for example, and some ostentatious lamps. By 1920, local government officials had been dispatched to the Arhakangura to negotiate the agreement. The district magistrate approached a recognized Mutawali who agreed that the mosque should be brought under government protection. It is not clear what exactly happened next, but the magistrate tells us in a letter of 1921 that, quote, certain notorious non-cooperators had taken advantage of the situation, claiming that Christians were attempting to seize control of the mosque. As a result, many of Adampura's Muslim residents decided to call a strike, but then resorted instead to marching some 500 strong to his courthouse to demonstrate their displeasure with the government's plan. The magistrate spoke to them, he wrote, but to no avail. He could not convince the gathered men of his and his government's good intentions. As a result, he recommended that the government drop the proposal to protect the mosque, at least for the present, and allow the local residents to undertake any needed repairs on their own. I'm going to simplify a rather complicated matter, so bear with me. What appears to have happened is that the government walked into the middle of some disagreement over who actually acted as the caretakers of the structure. The marchers were Julahas, the Ansari, impoverished Muslim weavers who lived in Adampura. The government had, however, negotiated with a leading gentleman of the neighborhood, likely a member of the landed classes, potentially the owner of the weaving looms that the mosque's partisans worked on. In any case, by 1922, Adampura's poor Muslims had collectively raised some 400 rupees and were actively engaged in making repairs to the mosque, including applying a new coat of whitewash. By necessity, I've left out a lot of detail in these small stories, but it's possible to glean some important information from them about the nature of the North Indian city life at this time. So we could, for example, speak about whitewash as a technology of architectural preservation, or rather an alternative technology. And really, if you'd like to talk about whitewash later, I'd be quite happy to. We could also say, for example, how British officials saw whitewash not as a preservation technology, but a form of obscuration and damage, limiting their ability to see architectural detail. We could speak about the propensity of certain social groups to speak for others when dealing with the colonial state, how caste and class status affected one's ability to represent group interests, and how the colonial state accepted or rejected such instances of speaking for others. Excuse me. The Kashi Samaj, for example, clearly wished to utilize the interests of Gatiyas, without consulting them, of course, to chastise the government in what was a long-running series of harassments over issues of taxation. While in Adampura, the vested interests of capital and the moneyed classes attempted through negotiation to secure a form of custodianship over a mosque, efforts which, like the Kashi Samajas, which were also unsuccessful. And lastly, we could speak about how the subjects of colonial rule often converted issues of money and taxation into matters of civilization and cultural importance. New taxes were, in the case of Benares's water infrastructure project, very often characterized as infringing upon traditional rights or socio-religious practices. But beyond these insights, what I think is also significant about these three moments captured in the paper and the ink of the archive is that they are all examples of what I want to call transactional colonialism. For some time now, I've wanted to understand how meaning of place is created through the process of infrastructural modernization in the North Indian city. This includes both the construction of new spaces associated with new technologies, but also the modernization of older spaces, the turning of mosques into monuments, for example. So if we want to ask after the qualities of the interactions between urban residents and the colonial state that lead to forms of urban belonging and personal investment, and if we want to ask how an individual's perception of his or her role in a city is made visible to the state, then the answer to these questions, I think, is not just through the small action of the everyday, but specifically through the transaction, rendering infrastructural space at the same time a kind of transactional space. I propose here that Indians are, or were, in fact, deeply entangled with the workings of the colonial state, and moreover, a state that sought to control their expectations, their behavior, and to elicit certain types of intentionality. And that this entanglement resulted in a multiplicity of transactions with the bureaucracy of the state. So I'm going to skip a little bit because I'm cognizant of time. But let me say first that I want to justify this notion of transactional colonialism by reference to three different things. First, transactions invoke notions of monetization and capitalism, reminding us that the colonial state was first and foremost an extractive enterprise dedicated to tax farming, sourcing cheap materials, as well as creating investment opportunities in goods markets. And in this way, using the notion of transaction can also be an inherent critique of colonial rule. My use of the term draws its inspiration from Georges Simel's early essay on the metropolis and mental life. In addition to seeing aspects of monetization and capitalism, however, Simmel also saw transactional qualities of city life as essentially creative, in forms of intellectual vitalization and of the making of enlarged horizons. Unlike Simmel, though, I see the transactional nature of infrastructural modernization as potentially rife with emotional content. City life need not turn human beings into just the functional objects of capitalism, in my view, but can instead elicit curiosity, anger, frustration, pleasure, and much besides. Second, the transaction tells us something about the colonial state itself and allows us to assess its nature at an operational rather than an ideological level. It allows us to recognize that the colonial state was not an administrative monolith, as many scholars seem to think, and that within its myriad moving parts, there were spaces available to create meaning about the places and the people its agents came into contact with. Equally, understanding the state as transactional allows us to see that it is not just a force allied with centralization, but also as a set of mechanisms that allowed for the emergence of local meaning, of localness, understood here as identity related to space and community. Indeed, it's a core argument of the book that it was not legislation or bureaucratic structures not legislation or the bureaucratic structures of governance itself as disembodied entities that brought into being some kind of localness, but that the transaction elicited by such structures did. An affinity to local urbanisms, in other words, was partly created through an interaction with the colonial state's bureaucracy, and not simply by that bureaucracy itself. Third and finally, the notion of the transaction seems to me historiographically useful because it makes it possible to understand this form of bureaucratic interaction as productive of meaning, even when such interactions might not produce substantive change in policy or practice. The mundane, everyday interaction with the directives and the agents of the state can be meaningful then, as in what Foucault calls a multiplicity of often minor processes. It is the interaction itself then, and not the outcome, that remains most important in making meaning. How much time do I have? 7 minutes? What do we got here? I think we can do it. So, in infinite respects, I see the colonial state as composed of a set of mechanisms and individuals that tended to refuse or at least devalue the interpretive labor of creating shared frames of reference, jointly understood meaning and common goals for the future. It is indeed not uncommon to read in the Colonial Administrator's Archive paragraphs in official correspondence that begin with, quote, "I fail to understand," or, quote, "it is inconceivable to imagine." But I think the reality is that the transactional nature of colonial rule and the continual need for the state to confront, to inquire, to ask, to direct, meant that such interpretive labor took place anyways. The agents of the colonial state had to ask after the motives of the state's subjects and to speculate about the intentions behind their actions. It required an extension of the imagination, in other words, to try to understand what other people were thinking and also to determine what is important, or what was important, to one's own self. And if this is true of the colonial state's agents, then it must also be true of the Banarsis who interacted with the state, those people who wanted services, who had a complaint, or who wanted to contest something. They had to speculate on what the motives of the state might be, but equally to think actively about what was important to them. It is evident, I think, that one doesn't always know what is important until it is threatened or coveted by another. And so, during a time of state-directed urban modernization, as forms of safety or sanitation, or indeed as the creation of a historical monument, I venture, if you want to understand what Benares meant as a modern city, as a place that supported people's livelihoods and their families and their health and their culture and their religious practice, then by all means you should look to the colonial archive. But don't take the word of the commissioner or the magistrate at face value. Instead, look to the ways that the Gatiyas and the weavers of Adampura, and even for that matter Chaman Lal and members of the Kashi Sujin Samaj, to see how they expressed to their colonial interlocutors how they thought about this place and its meaningfulness in their own lives. Lastly, let me say once again, or rather for the first time here, that it is most certainly not the case that Indian municipal constituents or urban inhabitants made meaning only through interaction with a European colonial state. The state was not omnipresent, of course, and there were plenty of meaningful realms which it did not and could not access. But it is an important site, and an examination of its workings can, I think, tell us much about how to revise the contours of recent debates that place the colonial state either at the center or the periphery of epistemic production in the North Indian city. To my thinking, the colonial state remains a crucial aspect of meaning-making in northern India, just not in the way that earlier advocates of the undifferentiated power of the colonial state had thought. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael, for that really finely grained and nuanced paper about transactional modernity and urbanism in North India. So we move next to Dr. Shruti Kapila, who will be speaking on the making of history, the missing history, of Indian conservatism.
Thank you very much to Amit for this invitation, and especially because so much of the work that I've been doing for the last 6-7 years, which has come to a conclusion, and I'm, unlike Michael, not drawing upon my book, which is on political thought from, say, Tilak to Patel, which is in press and will come out early next year with Princeton University Press. But I am beginning to now think about conservatism as a political ideology in India. So, in a way, it draws a little bit from my work that is coming out, but this is actually a new work. So let me say a couple of things. That this is a conference on forms of knowledge, and one of the great challenges actually Indian historiography, and as well as actually I think global historiography has, is that political thought has not really emerged as a real proper object of inquiry. Whereas we've constantly, in a way, if you see the Karenistic potential of, say, a Hobbes till date, which is not to say that India did not produce political thought. Quite the opposite. India produced a lot of political thought, and it is actually the claim of my book, and even today, that that it's intellectual historians who have to now reconstruct some of the most influential political actors into political thinkers. So if we look at the political thought that has been produced in India, this is something one has said several times, it has actually been made by people who are primarily political actors who have a lot of influence, whether it's Tilak, whether it is Gandhi, whether it is Patel, you name it. But we tend to think of them as only politicians rather than as thinkers. So the burden of my work has been to actually not see the instrumentality of their politics, but to reconstruct them, their conceptual vocabulary. So it's the same thing, which is not to say you do have the occasional full-time philosophers such as Iqbal. You do have people who are fully, as it were, committed to that thing. So I think one of the things to sort of gesture to the theme of the conference is that perhaps I don't know whether we need a canon, but we certainly need a certain stable set of reference points to start thinking about what political thought has done to Indian modernity, and like whether it's Pratap Mehta or whether it's Shakti Sinha's opening comments yesterday, or Faisal or various other people, I would agree that ideas are incredibly influential and have actually made, it's actually ideas which have made Indian political modernity rather than simply as it was social processes or cultural change, which has actually animated historians in general. right, or institutional histories. So these are my opening points, and I would date it, and I would say, and we can quibble about it, but as a historian, why not? Why don't I throw my date? I would say that actually the moment of the making of Indian political thought is, though you could have a longer genealogy, is actually with the failure of the Swadeshi movement, 1905-08 moment, when the political and politics has to be rethought anew, which is not to say that there is not a longer history, whether it is Bankim, whether you can go back, you can go back, infinitely. But I would say the concerns that the kind of things that interest me, like fraternity, like sovereignty, the very, very republicanism, these things actually become salient only after, as it were, the failure of Swadeshi is recognized by its key actors as well as then its. And the second point that Faisal and I had argued in our volume on the Gita, it is also the moment when Indian politics, despite the thrall of colonialism, are beginning to think of a future in which there is no empire. So it is already post-colonial in that sense, that their visions of the future do not have any role in that sense for the British. So today I want to talk. I did not organize my book on a political philosophy, but on a theme of sovereignty and violence. But today I am interested in the question of conservatism, because conservatism is incredibly powerful as a social force in India, and yet it is one of the striking features of Indian political life that there is no self-identified political party in India, which is conservative, right? We can talk about Hindu nationalism, whether it falls into it, but unlike, say, Britain, unlike America, there is no self-identified party which says, well, we are conservatives, barring the Swatantra Party. So the first question of the talk is, why the missing history is, I want to address this question, why hasn't there been a conservative political party in India, despite the fact that, as I said, conservatism remains a potent social and cultural force in Indian society. Okay, so I draw upon the work of two Cambridge historians, Richard Burke, who's a historian of political thought, as well as my other colleague, Christopher Clark, to talk about two things, which is and the second point being, why is it that conservatives tend to write history? So these are the two play in which why does history matter to political thinking in conservatism? So they're the two. So first, let me just say that what I mean by conservatism, because, of course, there are many ways to look into it. And I think the first thing is that we should be cautious and skeptical to saying that it's a coherent scheme of thinking. It is not a coherent ideology, and especially because, unlike, say, liberalism or communism, it is not a doctrinal ideology. It is what Richard Burke calls, it is primarily an instinct, it is a disposition. It is not really, it doesn't have, as it were, a set doctrine that it believes in, whether it's about property or individual rights. But we can identify, so it tends to be positional in general. And the main concern really is preserving procedures against radical change. So this is the question about temporality, that what conservatism is interested in is how to manage change. It is really about, it's a disposition also to time. Which is to say that, or Michael Frieden, that it's not, we tend to think that conservatives only want to preserve. That would be a mistake. It's a fundamental mistake to think that they believe in non-change. But what they are interested in is the prudent management of change, and therefore the key claim being that change is made safe. Whatever change is coming, it has to be made safer. That is, you can say, the concern with conservatism. There are various theories. So Karl Popper, of course, talked about incremental change, but really there is no direct relationship between party, as it were, and solidarity. And the kind of conservatism we identify today as, in general, in commentary or whatever, that community over individualism, etc., these are things that can be very quickly identified by Samuel Huntington. That is what Samuel Huntington rendered conservatism to be. Right? This is not what, say, Carl Schmitt was mentioned yesterday by Fassel, or, say, Mohler in the German tradition, or even Edmund Burke, the figurehead of conservatism, meant by it. But our general sense of what we think, particularly community over individualism, or the belief in hierarchy that we understand conservatism to stand for, is actually what Huntington did to very, very influential, but in a way slightly misleadingly. But so the things that are, just to kind of lay out a little bit more before I go into India immediately, is that having said that the kind of identified these three things, there's also been a very strong impulse in the conservative tradition of thinking in the idea of radical change. And here we can think about this is Mohler in Germany, but Carl Schmitt as well. But I think the thing that divides conservatives from any other political ideology is that they don't necessarily believe that man is equal. This is something which really, that man is socially or morally equal. This is one of the key differences that lies between, say, liberal thinking or even communist thinking. And I think this is something I do want to start opening up for the Indian story, because we tend to think about the Indian story certainly as a kind of uncontested belief in equality. Particularly because of Ambedkar, but actually there is a considerable debate in the Indian tradition. If you look at K.M. Munshi, if you look at even Deen Dayal Upadhyay, there is a concern. This is an open question whether man is not just socially equal but morally unequal. Okay, and so these are the things I would like to keep in mind. But and the second theme that really comes very important in the Indian tradition, and I identify that with Patel, is that it's authority alone which secures freedom, or authority alone or order alone which in a way secures liberty. And therefore, in a way, if you look at, say, from the 30s onwards, 1930s onwards, the obsession till date today, the obsession with sovereignty over freedom. In India today, we can identify as a debate between the return of sedition laws or any of those many things. But in a way, there is a debate between sovereignty and freedom. They are not the same thing. So that also, but for conservatives like Patel, it is authority or sovereignty alone, like a true conservative, which allows people to be free. This is their version. This is the conservative version of what freedom might mean. So, in a way, I'm jettisoning the way, say, Popper or Mannheim or even Huntington talked about conservatism, which is primarily a theory of traditionalism. Right, this is, but rather I'm interested more in the German tradition, in which that you have competing traditions and visions of future collide. That is really what conservatism is about, and how you, in a way, are going to manage that change. In India, there are three strands. I mean, I'm today being very morphological. I don't tend to do this, like, three things, two things. But there are three strands in Indian conservative thinking, in my mind. One is Gandhi, second Patel, and third is Hindu nationalism, which I do not consider entirely conservative, and because Hindu nationalism is, by its own name, it is a theory of nationality. It is not simply a political ideology. It is a theory of a particular kind of nationality. And they all owe something to a figure I have worked rather too much on, and that is Bal Gangadhar Tilak. But today I will not be talking about Tilak. So let me just sort of say very quickly the social context aside of it, why they may have not been a conservative party in India. right? And here there's been a very important book in 2017 written on global conservatism by someone called Ziblatt, and he talks about the preconditions of why conservative parties emerge, because global conservatism, it's a moment of global conservatism. And one of the things that I really, I totally agree with that book, is that you basically need a core constituency of elites who have a common grievance to have a conservative party. So the only way conservative parties emerge in modern politics is that you have a set of elites who are basically, who are quite diverse, but they have a common grievance. This was the French Revolutionary moment, indeed, for Europe, which produced that division. We know that's the same with the American story, and so on. Now, in India, having identified that there's conservatism but no party, I draw upon some other work to say that at the moment of Indian independence in 1947, the main issue is primarily the princes and the Indian big landlords, though they, of course, had a common grievance against the Republican project, the Nehruvian. They were too fragmented to come together, but most importantly, they were aggressively incorporated into the new democratic fold. So they were, in a way, defanged and depoliticized, and they were disallowed to have a common grievance to emerge. There are many ways we can think about it, but just to, before I go into the political thought element of it, but think about the moment of 47 and 50. You have 500 plus Indian princes. They may be fighting with, they may have various independent negotiations to want X, Y, or Z from the new coming dispensation, but the absence of a monarchical discourse is striking. There is no one arguing for the preservation of monarchy in India. I mean, if there is someone, please tell me. I would love to read that person. The only person who comes close to talking about the power of princely and monarchical power for the future of India is, strikingly, actually, Savarkar. It's Savarkar who writes about the Hindu crown, and who talks about, but he actually locates the Hindu crown not in India, but of course in Nepal, right? So this is one of the striking features, is the absence of an argument for monarchy, for, as it were, or hereditary power. So we have this question of caste as hereditary power, but that caste question is with Ambedkar, who, as I recently argued, sees, as it were, the Brahmin in India as a dispersed monarchy. So the problem with monarchy is twofold. One, that there is no real political creed behind it, the way you have it in say, revolutionary England, in France in early 19th, late 18th and the early 19th century. But secondly, as Ambedkar rightly identified, that the monarchical order in India was with the Brahmin. It was dispersed in the social fabric itself, rather than emerging in the form of one king or one sovereign power. But I can open that up later. But it's a striking feature of India's transition to republicanism that it is a Republican moment which has no contestation for aristocratic or monarchical power, which has, in a way, elsewhere identified that moment. So in a way, the aristocracy is absorbed in either it is not even, and also it is managed in the sense, because it is not killed off, it is absorbed into the new political fabric. And now we know there are several, petty talukadars to erstwhile big kingdoms, people who have transitioned into becoming democratic leaders, right? Whether it's the Scindias or whoever you can take. So there is no kind of, as it were, at a social level either, there is no great disruption. They may have lost money, but their social elite status is folded in. And of course here the instrument of privy purses is incredibly also important. And if there is an ideology which brings it together, and I would be keen to hear Faisal's view on it, it is actually Gandhi's idea of trusteeship and faith in elites to be morally called to do the good thing that also helps make this very violent transition into something which goes entirely unnoticed, right? So obviously we think about the princely folding primarily in terms of Hyderabad and Junagadh and Kashmir, but these are territorial matters, not in the sense that they become about sovereignty rather than about monarchy. And that's really the question that there's no argument for that. And here Gandhi's is interesting. So in a way, a radical break is avoided in terms of the social hierarchy right at the top. So in that sense, India retains a very strongly social conservative basis. Secondly, and finally, and then I'm now going to move to history in a minute, is actually you could say that the Congress, the 1950s, I know people think of it as a Nehruvian socialist moment, but one could easily revise it and say that actually it was the decade of conservatism in India, because some of the big ticket social reforms are thwarted. The Land Abolition Bill, which is, of course, where the big landlords are, who have kind of, kept their peace in 47, have their revenge in this moment and disallow the land redistribution. And secondly, of course, the Hindu Code Bill and Ambedkar's infamous, sad demise of a political career. So if you think of it in the 1950s, not simply in terms of planned economy and command economy and laissez-faire versus, that, but if you think about it more broadly in terms of social change, it is the moment of conservatism in India, because actually social conservatism and a large number of conservative policies win. And people like Purushottam Das Tandon, people like K.M. Munshi, these are the really powerful figures of the Nehru era, rather than I can't think of any socialist. Again, tell me if I'm wrong here. So in a way, so that's, in a way, the story of why there is no real conservative party in India. One, A, the social elites are absorbed, and B, that actually Congress is the home of conservatism in the first 15 to 20 years and which is, you can also, since we are all, I'm interested in the question of Hindutva and Hindu nationalism as well, which is also gives you an answer why it only takes the 1980s for, in a way, Hindu nationalism to emerge as an electoral party or a force in India. Okay, so this is in a way the context, and the late 60s, you can say 1966, is really the break point in the party political history of India, when you can say that the different elements of conservatism, economic laissez-faire, Hindu nationalism, and the question of trusteeship or caste, village, and joint family, they actually go into three divergent strands. Up until then, they were all within the Congress, or they were managed. So in a way, the first political moment of Indian conservatism, recognizably as a political force, separate political force, is 1966, with, of course, the Swatantra Party, but also Munshi and so on. So now I just kind of want to that's a kind of, in a way, the diversity, there's a kind of diversity and incoherence to Indian conservatism at one level. But at another level, which is what I want to turn to, there is a remarkable consistency in the political thinking of Indian conservatism. And that is on the question of time, temporality, and history itself. So why is it that we heard yesterday a great paper by the former Vice Chancellor of Delhi University about plastic surgery in ancient India, and this is a common trope, right? This is a really common trope in Indian historical thinking. We should not dismiss it and laugh it off. Of course, academic historians will say, what is this about? I mean, this is something we need to ask ourselves. This is not this, and so that's what I am going to turn to. And here there are two amazing pieces of work I recommend to read, from which I'm drawing upon. I'm going to talk a little bit about Savarkar now, and the people I'm drawing upon here are Francois Hartog's work on regimes of historicity, as well as my colleague Christopher Clark's work on time and power, and how, as it were, historicity and the way we think about history is essential to politics. Or how we think about time, not just our narratives, but how our disposition to time is essential to political action and so on. But let's not get too theoretical. Very factually, if you look at the two recent works by Dipesh Chakrabarti on Jadunath Sarkar, as well as Chris Bailey's work on liberalism, they both point to the fact that professional history comes late to India. At one level, it comes late. I mean, Jadunath Sarkar is a 20th century figure. But historicism, that Bailey calls, has informed all thinking from the 19th century onwards. It's a way of thinking about politics. So in a way, political thought in India has really been written in the historical register as well. So you have, whether it is R.C. Dutt, whether it's the economic nationalists, whether it is Savarkar, whether it is Nehru, whichever diversity of political opinion they might be in, the way political thought is conveyed is through historical scholarship. Right? And that poses a problem for us as academic historians, because their history and our history cannot be the same. And this is what Hartog argues about, and that's because that those histories are actually not simply political in any simple sense or partisan in any simple sense. They are concerned with the future. They are not concerned with the past. They're actually a prognostic form of scholarship. They're not, so they're utopian, to use an old-fashioned word. They're utopian texts, whether we like them, whether it's a good utopia or bad utopia, whether it's to my personal liking or not. But they're not, in a way, forms of scholarship or academic historiography, even though they borrow tools and elements of it. Their object of inquiry is completely different from, say, what as an academic historian. So which is why I think the debate will never be resolved when someone says there's plastic surgery in ancient India, and historians will say, where are the facts, right? These belong to two entirely different cognitive universes, and also very different points of view. So I want to talk a bit about so you have two ways of thinking. So I want to talk a little bit about Savarkar, because Savarkar is the one who, in a way, breaks the mold. So Bailey identifies historicism and evolutionary theory. Someone mentioned, I think Nilesh mentioned, science yesterday. So this kind of, in a way, is a very important element, and this continuity paradigm is there. But I would argue that this historicism is not simply about, say, providing organic unity to India, but it's really, in a way, it is a kind of juridical form, or it's a proof to say it stands for the testament to withstand change. That is what this work is doing. So at one level there is this question of heritage, which can be owned up. That India has had this great golden past. It has these great texts. It has this great science, and in a way, what Dodson Michael had argued in his first book, that this form of Indian thinking in the late 19th century is entirely owed to Orientalism. Right? It's the kind of domestication of Orientalism. But and that might be the case. The question is that when these people are doing this in the late 19th century, they are basically staking ownership on that history. It's not simply about saying this is the spiritual East, and they're basically staking ownership on it, and that's what I would say Munshi's project is also about. It's staking ownership on the past. It is also to make the past very proximate. It is to make the past, as it were, of the now, of the future, rather than something which has been finished. And in that sense, that also makes it a kind of usable political source. And this is a long tradition going back to the late 19th century, as I said, whether it's Orientalists. And you see that you could even say a text like a seminal text like Discovery of India is also very similar to that in the sense it has a long durée to talk about India. But it's not in the same genre. It's not. But it is also basically a juridical exercise. What is in Discovery of India trying to say? It is basically saying this is the testament that India will produce a different kind of nationality. That it will. So it's a juridical exercise. It is not simply. It is giving proof that in a way India's nationality will come out of diversity. So you have people like, say, Munshi, or you have others like various other kind of Hindu scholars who talk about the past in terms of a golden age. That I would say is what Bailey or others have called. It's a form of idealism. It's a form of evolutionary history. It is to make change safe. But I think what is interesting is someone like Savarkar, who also draws upon the long durée. So everyone is into the long durée, but his is not a text like either the Discovery of India, which again is using a kind of organic continuity model for India's long past, for a different kind of proof that India has this. India has this testament to modern nationality. But it is the first account which in a way breaks from the dominant modes. I'm thinking about Six Glorious Epochs, which is actually written in early 1960s. And what is striking about Six Glorious Epochs is that it does not mention the word Hindutva even once. Okay, it doesn't. And it's an incredibly long book, and this is written 40 years after, 40 years after actually 40 odd years after Savarkar has already written Essentials of Hindutva. Right. So Savarkar deploys like whether it's Dutt, whether it's all the other Indian political thinkers, is interested in history, but unlike all these other figures, he's the only one who deploys a new form, a different kind of historiographical model, which is the military model. Military history is his preferred historiographical style. Right. So if Nehru, for Nehru, the grand story, quite apart from offering a testament to India's nationality out of diversity, there is no the fall and rise of India's greatness is not associated. Is not associated with any particular good or evil character. So he desubjectivizes forces. So there are forces which are bad for India. There are forces which are good for India. But there is no, as it were, it's not even like, say, Jadunath Sarkar's, where certain emperors are identified as decadent and bad or good. So in a way, Nehru's history is really interesting in that sense that it is very abstract on the question of causation of fall and decline. It just says, there are forces which are enemy-like or foe-like forces, so there is no subjective identity. I say this because the point of Savarkar's Six Glorious Epochs would be twofold. One, that it would not be just a theory or a historiographical style, a new style of doing history, but it will lay down the conditions of possibility. It's for the futurity of Hindutva. So it is a prognostic text while it goes back into history. So it would be a mistake to read it as an unfolding of a past, but rather it is interested in the conditions of possibility for new histories to emerge. This is what it is interested in. And in a way, the 6 glorious epochs, which is what he defines in the long durée, are pointing to those 6 kinds of conditions that India's history has laid out. Because both Savarkar and, I know it sounds counterintuitive, both Savarkar and Nehru are agreed on one fact regarding India, which is that it is too mature, it is too old, and it is always too developed. And therefore, where does the dynamism come from for this history? Right? The problem, as you must have read Nehru's autobiography, he goes to the Harappa site and he's stunned that, in its oldest form, it looks so developed. Right? There are these drains, there are cities, and he says, goodness, even in its prehistoric form, it is a fully developed place. So the problem is how to inject vitality, how to inject youth, how to inject dynamism, how to inject change in this, the problem being that India has such an old history. So both Savarkar and Nehru are bothered by the same problem, but they have very different ways into this problem. Of course, we know that Nehru's interest would be knowledge and science for that, or new knowledge and new technologies. But of course, the trope for Savarkar, of course, is war. That it's how many, 5 minutes? Yeah, it's war alone. It's war alone which allows for dynamism in Indian history. So this is again a counter to Gandhi. In a way, again, Gandhi and Savarkar kind of agree, because Gandhi dislikes history precisely because it is only a testament to violence. And for Savarkar, the dynamism of India's past comes from its ability not simply to forge war, but to identify enmity. The question is not that the question is not that you go to war. The question is how do you determine who the enemy is? And that is what 6 Glorious Epochs is, so which is precisely why it is a political text of laying down the conditions for, as it were, how Hindutva might emerge. And in a way, he basically does not take the heroic form, which is how regimes of historicity are normally forged. You pick up heroes, and in his past writing he had used the heroic form, whether it is about the Sikhs or the Marathas or other martial those, or the mythic, which is what say people like Munshi and all would do. He picks the event. The 6 glorious epochs are actually 6 meta events in India's history, and these meta events are are events of violence which break in a way India's long stasis. So, in a way, you could say finally, and I shall conclude here, that what this is doing, and very quickly, that what the war question is doing is not simply adding a kind of dynamism to India's very static past. And as you know, Savarkar is very opposed to what would otherwise go as Hindu histories. He doesn't like Puranas. He doesn't like any of the old mythic epic histories. He says, no, that is not history. History begins when we can actually date and have. So he wants to do the empirical stuff. But really, as a form of futurity, it also it also wants to identify enemies not simply from the past, but it wants to intervene in the present. It's an intervention in the present. And my final revisionist point here is that the key enmity that Savarkar identifies in India is not Islam, it is not Muslims, it is Buddhism. And again, the key problem he identifies in India's history, it's also there in Essentials of Hindutva, and in fact, again, much agreement here with Ambedkar in that sense. Ambedkar also says that the key enmity, the key civil war in India's history is the civil war between Buddhists and Brahmins. But Savarkar argues, he picks up Ashoka He singularizes Ashoka as the figure who has disallowed the formation of nationality and modern sovereignty and nationality in India. And I can answer why that might be. No, it's not simply a question of non-violence, but the point of these recollections from these long durées of the past is actually to make not just the past proximate, as I'm trying to say, but it is also to identify enemies in the present. So Ambedkar will stand for Buddhism, Gandhi will stand for non-violence, while being fully named in these texts. And in that sense, the six glorious epochs is interested in the history of India as radical change and as and as it were, I suppose, it lays down the conditions for the possibilities of fulfillment of Hindutva. So I'll conclude.
Well, thank you very much, Shruti. As always, a really striking argument with much for us to think about. So we move on finally to Professor Emil Farooqi, who will be speaking on austerity, learning, and the colonial conditions, some comments on Gandhi's early experiences.
This paper reflects on some of the problems that Gandhi faced in acquiring formal education. Most of what I have to say is very well known. I've just tried to see if we could use his experiences to be able to understand the problems that people of his class faced in acquiring formal education in the late 19th century. Gandhi worked hard in his early youth to acquire a decent education. The story is well known. He himself provided a fairly detailed account of his high school days and his London sojourn in My Experiments with Truth. Institutions for imparting knowledge beyond what might be considered merely rudimentary were almost non-existent in Kathiawar of the late 19th century. It was Mohandas's good fortune that his family resided in Rajkot, which had a high school. As late as the 1870s, Kathiawar had only 3 high schools and no college. An arts college, the first in the region, was established in the early 1880s in the neighboring Bhavnagar state. Gandhi attended this college for a few months before his departure for England, retaining no pleasant memories of it. The choice of London was obviously dictated by the lack of career options other than lowly positions for products of such institutions. However, the Gandhi family did not really have financial resources for an English education for Mohandas. It also lacked influence and political clout, even though his father, grandfather, and uncle had been important functionaries in several princely states in Gujarat. Mohandas and his elder brother had to literally go around with a begging bowl, which would have been quite humiliating for the teenager. The draft of Gandhi's unpublished Guide to London, written perhaps in 1893-94, though perhaps a little earlier, is a remarkable document in that it is the outcome of the experiences of an exceptionally sensitive, observant, and curious person attempting to live frugally, continuously contemplating how such humiliation may be avoided. It is intended for the student of extremely limited means from the colony, seeking prudently and with dignity to make good use of an opportunity available only to a few of studying in the metropole. The tentative title of this tract, which appears in the first volume of the collected works, is a little inapt as it does not convey the intensity with which it was written. We shall have more to say about this text later. Suffice it to say for the moment that its intensity is a reflection of Gandhi's own feelings, the realization of being an underprivileged colonial subject. In his response to a question regarding what had motivated him to travel to Britain to study law, during the course of an interview with the Vegetarian on the eve of his departure from London in June 1891, Gandhi had candidly stated, in a word, ambition. This was not just personal ambition. He was expressing the ambitions of his social class, a section of which was threatened with impoverishment. The social group to which his family belonged, salaried employees attached to the darbars of petty Kathiawar states, was anxious about its future, given that it was becoming increasingly difficult to earn a livelihood the way it had been possible a few generations earlier. What is more, this was a social group which had little or no capital to invest in business, hardly possessed any landed property, and had not been able to accumulate wealth through thrift, even though they might have had lifestyles which were not too lavish. Such was the case with Gandhi's family. I quote, "My father never had any ambition to accumulate riches and left us very little property." A good education was the key to better prospects, and this was something that Mohandas and his well-wishers were acutely aware of. 8 decades of colonial presence in Saurashtra had apparently resulted in stagnation, which was reinforced by the peculiar political configuration of the region, wherein extreme fragmentation led to unviable polities with access to resources on a minuscule scale, scarcely a prescription for any meaningful development. Colonialism had a stifling impact. Towards the end of the 19th century, the capital of Imperial Kathiawar, Rajkot, headquarters of the Kathiawar Agency, was still in the bullock cart era. It took 5 days to cover the distance of 200 kilometers between Rajkot and Porbandar. And I quote, "There was no railway in those days," Gandhi observed while describing his own journey in early 1888. It was a 5 days bullock cart journey. His father, Karamchand or Kaba, met with a serious accident, which hastened his death in trying to reduce the duration to 3 days when he was hurrying towards Porbandar on the occasion of Mohandas's wedding. The coach, which had been provided for Kaba by the ruler of Rajkot to undertake the journey, toppled over in the 3rd stage and he sustained several injuries. He arrived bandaged all over. For traveling to Bhavnagar to take admission in college after his matriculation, the camel cart of Abu Bakr Jamal was hired to carry Mohandas part of the distance, the remaining being covered by train. The journey to London too commenced on a bullock cart. From Rajkot, Gandhi proceeded towards Jaipur via Gondal, thence by railway eastwards to Dhola Junction on the recently completed section of the Bhavnagar State Railway line. Rajkot and Gondal were connected by rail only in 1896. Rajkot town could boast a prestigious school meant exclusively for princes of the ruling houses of Kathiawar, the Rajkot Rajkumar College, a sort of Eton for the aristocracy of Western India, as the gazetteer says, which had been functioning since 1871. This was an institution for the political indoctrination of young Rajkumars. The high school for so-called commoners included Alfred High School, also known as Kathiawar High School, in Rajkot, in which Gandhi studied. In an earlier era, Kaba could hold positions in the courts of Porbandar, Rajkot and Vankaner, despite his extremely inadequate formal learning. He had no education, save that of experience. At best, he might be said to have read up to the 5th Gujarati standard. Of history and geography, he was innocent, but his rich practical experience stood him in good stead in the solution of the most intricate questions and in managing hundreds of men. Such opportunities were rapidly shrinking by the time Gandhi came of age. Access to institutions such as Alfred High School made it possible for young boys of Mohandas's generation belonging to families of lesser civil servants to find jobs in the petty darbars of Kathiawar or establishments supported by them. The careers of some of Gandhi's contemporaries at the high school give us a sense of the ambitions of this social group, ambitions that Mohandas is likely to have nurtured. One of his classmates, Tribhuvan Purushottam Bhatt, found employment in the Rajkot Darbar as Diwan. Another, Amritlal Vardhaman Modi, became judicial secretary in the princely state of Dharangadra, and Ratilal Ghelabhai Mehta joined Alfred High School as a teacher and went on to become its headmaster. Then there was Pran Shankar Joshi, who studied with Mohandas at the school and became his classmate at Samaldas College in Bhavnagar, where Gandhi was enrolled for a few months before going to England. Prakash Shankar later taught at a high school in Bombay before becoming the Diwan of the state of Gondal. Similarly, Hargovind Vyas, one of the Sanskrit teachers at Alfred School, moved on to serve as a senior official in the Radhanpur Darbar. The Radhanpur was one of the princely states comprising the Palanpur Agency in Gujarat, north of Kathiawar. Another contemporary from Rajkot, Manilal Harilal Mehta, who was Gandhi's classmate at Samaldas College, became Joint Chief Justice of the Bhavnagar state. Gandhi himself and his family took his schooling quite seriously, so that as the youngest child in the family, he was the best educated. As a student from the Sorat sub-region of Saurashtra, in which both Porbandar and Junagadh were situated, he was eligible for scholarships endowed by Junagadh and the state of Jetpur, which was also located in Sorat. Gandhi made it a point to give definite particulars in experiments about the financial support he had received in school. And he was quite accurate about his this 40 years later. In the 5th and 6th standard, I obtained scholarships of 4 and 10 rupees respectively, an achievement for which I have to thank good luck more than any merit. For the scholarships were not open to all, but reserved for the best boys among those coming from the Sorat division of Kathiawar. And in those days, there could not have been many boys from Sorat in a class of 40 to 50. His performance in the examination for the 5th standard was actually quite good. He was 6th among the 34 students out of 37 in the class who sat for the annual exam. In the annual exam for the 6th standard, Gandhi stood 4th. His performance entitled him to an enhanced scholarship sum in the 7th standard, the uppermost standard, 10 rupees a month, as he correctly recalled nearly 4 decades later in his autobiography. Mohandas' successful matriculation would have been regarded as quite an achievement for the family as a whole, since this was considered the first step towards a career that would be in keeping with its aspirations, yielding a secure income from a profession that accorded with its social standing. As Gandhi noted in the interview to the vegetarian mentioned earlier, I matriculated at the Bombay University in the year 1887. Then I joined Bhavnagar College, for unless you graduate at the Bombay University, you get no status in society. The advice of a respected family friend, Maoji Dave, that Mohandas ought to consider going to England to study law, was clearly intended to help him improve his chances of getting a good position in one of the Kathiawar darbars rather than actually practicing as a barrister. Mere graduation from an Indian university would equip him for a clerical job at the most. As an England returned barrister, he would have a competitive edge over other potential candidates. The times are changed, Dave pointed out to his elder brother, and none of you can expect to succeed to your father's gaddi without having had a proper education. Now, as this boy is still pursuing his studies, he counseled, you should all look to him to keep the gaddi. It will take him 4 or 5 years to get his BA degree, which will at best qualify him for a 60 rupees post, not for a diwanship. If, like my son, he went in for law, it would take him still longer, by which time there would be a host of lawyers aspiring for a diwan's post. I would far rather that you sent him to England. This was a prescription for a great leap forward. Gandhi's London diary records the desperation which actuated the fundraising campaign of Mohandas and his elder brother Lakshmidas. It was with great difficulty that some money was obtained, most of it from on credit, which Lakshmidas for the time being undertook to repay. This amounted to about 11,000 rupees or 666 pounds, the precise figure mentioned by Gandhi in a letter addressed to Frederick Lely, written within a few months of his arrival in England. Lely was then the principal colonial official in Porbandar. Gandhi had unsuccessfully applied to him for financial support prior to his departure. The letter may or may not have been conveyed to Lely by Lakshmidas, to whom it was dispatched for onward transmission. In this letter, Gandhi made a fresh appeal to the Porbandar administrator for financial aid, saying that he would need an additional 400 to cover his expenses. He had already raised more than about 600 pounds. Nevertheless, through his own experience, his constant endeavor to reduce his expenses to the bare minimum, Gandhi arrived at a much lower figure than the total outlay he had originally estimated during the first weeks of his stay in London, close to 1,100 pounds, while calculating the amount that an Indian student would require for studying law in Britain. By the time he left England, he reckoned that 420 pounds, or about 7,000 rupees, would suffice for the purpose. Assuming that the student was well informed and had given some thought to the matter, he considered anything beyond 420 pounds to be absolutely superfluous. The minute details of the item-wise breakup provided by him in his guide to London bear testimony to the care with which Gandhi made the optimum use of his very meager resources. It would be worthwhile to quote at length the advice offered to young men, women are certainly not part of the intended audience, aspiring to become barristers. The reasoning advanced for the total worked out by Gandhi, 420 pounds in all, goes beyond monetary considerations. It prefigures some of his later ideas about simple living and austerity. And I quote, "I shall just diverge from my main subject. I am going immediately to point out that from every point of view, the life you would have to lead on 420 pounds, incidentally, on further consideration, he brought down the figure to 400 pounds. The life you would have to lead on 420 pounds would be happier than the life led by many a student in India. And mind, 10,000 rupees would not supply you with luxuries." That's the money he had carried with him. "They would simply make you pine for more to vie with your luxurious brothers and thus, in fact, make you more miserable. Did you say one room in England would not be sufficient for you? I ask you then, what have you been having here? Do you not sleep, even though you may be the son of a rich man, 2 or 3 in one room, a room without a carpet, without any furniture, surrounded by dirty ditches, having hardly a window or two?" This is followed by some practical tips, reflecting the reflection he had to cope with upon his return to India. If you have 10,000 rupees, keep them. Only spend out of them 6,000 rupees, or the equivalent of 420 pounds. And the rest you will be able to command on your return to India. It is absolutely necessary that you should have some money, 10,000, 1,000, 2,000 rupees, or any such sum at your disposal. Then you would not regret having gone to England. On that you would be able to build your position. But if you have not got the foundation money, any edifice you may hope to build without that foundation would crumble down to pieces, and you would find yourself in the open air without an edifice. For there is no work waiting for you on your return. There may be empty honors and congratulations just to sting you. Therefore, if you take the advice of one who has undergone the bitter experience and would profit by it, if you have 10,000 rupees, only spend 420 worth and keep the rest to be spent in India, and you would be happy and contented. Indeed, if you do not expect to command about 2,000 rupees on your return, it were advisable not to go to England at all for a barrister's education, unless, of course, you expect to get some suitable appointment for the 2,000 or some such sum are as indispensable for India as the 420 pounds for England. Lakshmi Das had to marshal the resources of the extensive family network of the Gandhis to obtain the sum required for Mohandas' trip. 10,000 rupees was a substantial quantity of hard cash for those who were part of this network. Even though most of the amount was to be a loan, the social stratum to which relatives and friends of the Gandhi family belonged did not have access to resources that could be easily converted into ready money. I know by personal experience, Gandhi recalled upon his return to India, how even persons who have promised on oath to give some pecuniary assistance, a loan mind you, not an absolute gift, and whom you think you can safely depend upon, prove false to their promises. For this reason, the momentous step taken by Mohandas with the support of his elder brother was a bold one. This was the biggest hurdle that had to be overcome. By comparison, the reservations expressed by some of the senior members of the family did not pose much of a problem. At Rajkot and Porbandar, the disapproval on religious grounds was mild and easily taken care of. As Gandhi set out on the first lap of his journey from Rajkot to Bombay, a host of well-wishers came to bid him farewell. He specifically names nearly 20 of them. Several more greeted him en route. Dr. Bhau and Kapoor Bhai at Gondal. At Dhola, he was met by Narandas, Pranchankar, Narbhay Ram, Anand Rai, Vrajlal, and Usman Bhai. Usman Bhai travelled with him by train till Vadhavan. This was indeed a warm send-off. Gandhi was not lonesome at the moment of parting. Such effusiveness on the part of so many people must have instilled more confidence in him. A few days prior to his departure, a get-together was organized by some of his former schoolmates, which got a brief mention in the press. Gandhi discovered that he had become something of a minor local celebrity. After all, it was not a routine occurrence at this time for a boy from a not too affluent family of small town Saurashtra to embark upon a journey to England for higher studies. At Bombay too, he was not entirely on his own. A few of his friends and relatives had escorted him to the port city. Here he encountered more vociferous opposition to his venture. Some busybodies who claimed to be leaders of the jati to which the Gandhi family belonged tried to prevent him from proceeding to London by invoking religious injunctions against travelling overseas. Gandhi responded combatively. There was far too much at stake for him and his family for the plan to be abandoned. Moreover, he and his companions seemed to have figured out that the so-called community elders had overestimated their strength. Their actions caused some annoyance, especially since preparations for the voyage had to be made hurriedly amidst continuing uncertainty over money. By the last quarter of the 19th century, it was becoming possible to disregard conservative religious practices that discouraged long-distance overseas travel, with sections of the Kathiawadi elite shedding inhibitions about going to Europe. Mavji and his son, Keval Ram, had cited examples of individuals from Rajkot who had built successful careers upon their return from Britain, where they had pursued higher studies. Besides, there was the ruler of the Gondal state, Thakur Bhagwat Singh Ji, who in 1883 became the first princely ruler of a Kathiawadi state to visit Europe. Upon his return, he published a journal of his tour, thus publicizing his trip. In 1883 itself, the chief of Morvi state, situated close to Wankaner, also undertook a tour of England. Then, in 1886, Bhagwat Singh Ji went to Edinburgh to study medicine, receiving an honorary LLD degree in 1887. He took part in some of the official events organized in London to celebrate the Golden Jubilee of Victoria's coronation. Surely there would have been excitement about this high honor among officials and hangers-on of darbars in the region. Incidentally, the rulers of Gondal and Morvi were two of the only 3 Indian princes presented to the Queen on the occasion of the 1897 Jubilee. This was the mood from which Gandhi derived the strength to instinctively reject xenophobic exclusiveness, an attitude that was crucial for the evolution of his ideas in later years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Farooqi, for that really, truly fascinating account of Gandhi's early years and its connection with his later thoughts on simplicity and austerity. So we have some 15 minutes for questions for any of the speakers. Yeah, sorry. Charu, yeah.
Thanks so much for those absolutely wonderful presentations. I have 2 questions. My first question is to Mani. I really enjoyed your paper. So I was just thinking, when you talk of the transactional, qualities of city life, I was wondering how you see the massive proliferation in petitions, that became central to urban transactions in terms of caste, class, and gender. In some ways, the examples that you have narrated also rest on the centrality of petitions, which were not categorical assertions, but negotiations in some ways. So how do you think Banaras as a city really qualifies as a classic case of describing a modern city in colonial India, And to Shruti, well, it's great, to have you here, a friend, someone with whom I did my PhD and enjoyed so many conversations with you. So in this trope of conservatism, Savarkar appears to be very different from someone like Munshi. So they also do not seem to meet in terms of a futuristic conception, as far as I can make out. Savarkar seems to be going not for a prudent, safe change, but rather a catastrophic one, which rests on the central trope of war. So I don't know how well he fits into the conservative political in that sense, given that Hindutva may find its resonance in a modernist articulation much more. I was also wondering about the vernacular sensibility that is deployed in articulating ideas of conservatism, which can have distinct Indian sensibilities. So if you can say something on that.
Thank you very much. So Banaras as a modern city, this is exactly what I'm trying to get at. So the whole entire book is really about if we think of modernity as a particular kind of attitude towards the future, which is one of the things I like to think about. When I think about what makes a modern city, it is about building. It is about the creation of new space. It is about essentially the embrace of technology. This is what Benares is doing at this time. And so what I'm interested more than anything is not to see it as an imposed modernity or an engrafted modernity onto a traditional city, but rather to understand the ways in which Banarsis themselves engaged in the project of modernity, part and parcel through their interactions with the colonial state. So if the colonial state points to something like the waterworks as an emblem of this engrafted modernity, what we might do instead is to point to the ways in which Banarsis themselves not just participated in the making of the waterworks, but rather were in an intrinsic set of negotiations and meditations and interactions with the state about what the format of that modernity might look like and what it might mean. And I actually think that the kind of physical emblems of the city's modernity is not particularly important, but rather it's how the city, the residents of the city re-engage with things like taxation and things like what's an appropriate form of taxation. How should taxes be levied on a population that had alternative taxation arrangements in place already? So this, I think, goes straight to your other question, which is how, if we think of transactions as something that are, capitalist or in a way modern, and yet at the same time it's quite clear we see this large uptick, as I said, of kind of groups that are emphasizing the traditional qualities of Benares, right? Its religious qualities, its non-commercial qualities. And I think that part of the point of the paper is to say that it is just the challenges of the colonial state that bring these kinds of vocalizations of what's important to people in the city to the fore. And I don't want to say that it's kind of a call and response, right? Kind of a model. But rather that these are ongoing conversations, ongoing transactions. And I think that in a lot of cases, even though the colonial state may win the debate, right, because they have the power of force and the power of governance behind them, that it's these interactions themselves, these small things like a takta, right? You don't think about taktas because actually they don't exist anymore. But they were a huge part of the landscape of the city, and they meant something. They meant something not only in terms of kind of the visuality of space, but also in terms of people's livelihoods. And so to be able to think about how the tradition of the takta coexists with the sensibilities of an increasingly modern city. Right? It's a hard thing to do, but you can only kind of catch these little glimpses in the way that people interact over them.
Thanks, Charles. So nice to see you. In fact, I wanted to say It's nice to be here with two people from my PhD years, Michael and yourself. So I forgot to say that. So it's wonderful. And as ever, very good questions. And, I'm very indebted to your work on as it were, how, as it were, the social life of Hindu nationalism appears, right? But let me just say that what I was trying to do, it was a very rushed affair, was that how do we understand this obsession with the longue durée as the framework for writing history, right? Whether it is Savarkar, whether it is Nehru. And I just took these two examples today to just make that question stark. You see that even in Ambedkar, in fact, in his writings on the Dharma Shastras and so on. But always the preferred time frame of writing history is the long durée for all of them. And I wanted, with Savarkar, I want to say that it's not, unlike Nehru, a proof of India's nationality, but it is a further thing. It is trying to find out what gives India its identity, right? It's not a question of nationality in six glorious epochs, but whether even if you look at his small tract, my claim actually, this is actually in the book, the forthcoming book, the claim is that actually people should read Hindutva together with six glorious epochs, because six glorious epochs is an elaboration of the claims made in the manifesto of the 1920s, right? Of course, he writes a lot, but this is his final work. And I also think that this is a work which is meant as in dialogue, contestation with the discovery of India. Okay, so that's the But the point is that he's interested in figuring out India not, second claim, not as a territorial unity, which is what we seem to be thinking about always, but he actually he sees what I'm calling India as a temporal plot. It is a temporal. It's a plot of history rather than it's a problem of time that India faces. So yes, to that extent, he's much more Schmittian. He's much more, say, like a Moeller, who's interested in the question of radical change, right? But that radical change, even as his book is pointing out, doesn't happen every 10, 15 years. It happens, every several centuries. It takes several centuries for those breakpoints to occur, and there are only 6 breakpoints in his reckoning. So in a way, of course, he is not like Munshi in the sense that Munshi is interested in just this kind of, as it were, making change safe. The argument that my argument I put, but there are also, finally, if you read Six Glorious Epochs, the way I read it, there are 2 axes to that history. There is a kind of manifest content, which is all about wars, this, that, and there is a latent content. What people would say, what frames the work together. And it is the latent content in which, as it were, this dynamism, this warlike thing is discussed as. But if you read it very simply, you would say, oh my God, this is a long history. It doesn't make you feel some radical change is coming. It is not in that kind of military conquest. So it does both those things. It does offer this theory of change as war bringing change, and the second is that it does give you that, I won't use the word comfort, but it does give you that long durée expanse that you are feeling that you're in this civilizational story which is unfolding. So that's what I would say. And on the vernacular, I wanted to say that of course, which is the million-dollar question, which is how I started by saying that India has a lot of conservatism in its bloodstream, but no conservative party, and I was interested in extracting the formalist elements rather than, as it were, its life force or its social life. Thanks.
Well, in the few minutes that we have left, let's collect a few questions. And you have one as well. Okay. So, yes. Shabal, yourself, 2 of you here, and there's one there.
My question is addressed to Shruti. Thank you for your very insightful paper on this important subject. The distinction that you make between academic historiography and the what you describe as prognostic historicism. It certainly exists at some level, probably especially in the recent times. But I think that it is a more blurry sort of distinction that we can possibly make in this, because in the colonial context of India, all historiography that was written during the colonial period and for many decades later also, whether it was by people who were directly involved in nationalist politics or by so-called professional historians, it did have a very strong prognostic element. So, for example, you read the writings of somebody like Bipin Chandra, who was such a mainstream historian, very well known, very important. So it's only in the relatively recent times that you find academics who are more or less completely sort of, disjointed from that prognostic thing, and they have started writing a history which is totally different. Now, this brings me to the other argument that, you make about Sahaswani Pane, that is 7 Glorious Epochs of History, which Savarkar wrote at the fag end of his life. Last book, and by far, yes, it's the fattest book and very important. And there he sort of, and you have rightly, sort of compared his book with the discovery of India. And why is it that Gandhi ultimately, of all leaders, is the person who talks least about history, in fact, of all the great leaders? I think it is because Gandhi was acutely aware, though he never articulated it, that history is a contested ground. So it is better to talk about history only as an abstraction, because if Nehru could write a discovery of India and derive one kind of nationalist discourse on the basis of history, Savarkar could write the complete opposite of it, especially in the 7 epochs where his ideas have matured. So Gandhi successfully sort of escapes that trap. This is what I think.
Thank you, Professor Emil Farooqi, for your intriguing treat on Gandhi's austerity and resource management. I was wondering that Gandhi's mother was a Kabirpanthi and was also introduced to the Punami sect of the mystics and also hailed from a mercantile family. So whether this convergence of the mystic and the merchant trained Gandhi to carry forward this resource management.
I was curious to know about Savarkar's notion of sovereignty, because you pointed out that he actually envisaged Hindu crown in opposition to, which was not present in the, of the princely states. So how was this, built up, like to think about a Hindu crown which is not also territorialized? Because on reading his biography, which is on the experience of his transportation to Andamans, I think he reads against the pan-Islamism and deterritorialized notion of that as being inimical to to Hindu nationalism or Hindutva. So how do you actually read both of them?
My question is to Shruti Kapila. It was a beautiful paper on Indian conservatism and its nuances. Maybe more nuances can be brought out. Okay, but I was thinking at a more fundamental level. You treated the Swadeshi period as a point of departure. Okay. Now, to me, it was certainly a watershed, but can we call it a total break? I think we can push this history of Indian conservatism back to at least mid-19th century when they started imagining their nation. Nationalism itself was an important root of conservatism. And you did talk about historicism. You can associate this historicism with nationalism. A colonized people, when they try to become a nation, they have to assert their cultural superiority in the face of the colonizers, and so that called for some conservatism. So this is my first point. I'll be very brief. The second point, I think that too can be traced back to the 19th century, maybe to the first half of the 19th century. This was perhaps a part of becoming middle class. okay, all these political thinkers, they come from middle class. They were becoming middle class from about this time. Maybe the old elites, they were becoming middle class through some addition and alteration. Now, this was required by middle class, the notion of middle class respectability. That required some conservatism, I think. Maybe transactional conservatism, okay, things will change, but at the same time, we'll have to make it safe. This was there. Today, we no longer make a sharp distinction between conservatives and modernists, between Ram Mohan Roy and Radhakant Dev, for example. That is obsolete. We know that, well, they were both, conservatism and modernism, both were there. They tried to combine the two. So I think this is another route of Indian conservatism, becoming middle class. This was on their agenda. Think of gender. Okay, the new woman. Okay. So this is number 2. Number 3, another route, maybe that can be, that has a longer history, that is the caste system. The caste system, you did talk about a basic belief in inequality, belief in authority rather than in freedom. It is authority that secures freedom. So maybe that has to be taken into consideration. Thank you. These are just some suggestions,
Exceptionally, my congratulations to all 3 panelists for the very incisive. There's only one question which bothers me, and also perhaps for the future young people to do the research. One is that Gandhi, your comments, austerity certainly, but he was a man of action. Nehru was also a man of action in 2 different ways. Because Gandhiji and Lal Bahadur Shastri, these are the only 2 leaders of my generation whom I could not shake hands with. Sarojini Naidu said it stopped as it came out. Secondly, the events at Allahabad in 1942, they were very clear. The emergence of Swaraj Party, Rajaji visited there and he said his views. Now, the question arises, you made a mention that the princes were too disorganized to do that. I think they paid 20,000 or 2,000 rupees to Dr. M.R. Jaikar, who was a great barrister, to advise the Nawab of Bhopal. He was the Chancellor of Chamber of Princes, so you might look into it, that they did attempt. The Sir C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer in Kerala, he said, what are you worried about? You be independent, because Mountbatten played a very key role. And he says, paramountcy lapses and transfer of population was not there. You say either join Pakistan or you become independent. So 3 of them only thought of independence. Kerala and some other, and then that continues. The Malayali people. So these are the 2 things. And then finally the gender. Nobody mentioned the gender. Gandhiji's treatment of Kasturba, his own wife, you might look into it as to how he treated. Like a typical, you can call it Indian woman, but secondly, there were people like Professor Berrier Elbin, a great Oxonian. After independence, everybody realized that we didn't have Indians manning the borders and the disputed now. Well, the Chinese were very clear. The moment 1949, the communists became imperial power, they thought of the old imperial glory. And they started attacking Tibet mercilessly. Nehru knew it very well, and now everybody criticizes here. But at 47, he tried to find out the Indians, and some of them went there and tried to check the communist domination, which is now complete overkill. So nobody mentioned about the situation in Tibet at that time. So this is one factor which you might look into it. And thank you very much. It's a great treat for me to be with you, and I'll have a personal interview with all the 3, including the chair, for what I've gathered, a few questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe you can ask the question and answer the question.
Shruti, in your presentation, you made a couple of references to the Swatantra Party. And I thought that perhaps in talking of Indian conservatism, that a little, if you could have just a little more about the Swatantra Party. C. Rajgopalachari was so sort of, I mean, if there is someone who really is the quintessential conservative, it's C. Rajgopalachari. No, there's a reason why I thought that, it's important to talk about the Swatantra Party, because it represented a conservative, right-wing politics, which also was committed to a secular state. And that distinguished the Swatantra Party from other sort of strands of conservatism and the right wing. And in that context, perhaps Rajgopalachari is so crucial because of his very sort of strong commitment to a secular state. And I think, this reference to C.P. Ramaswamy Iyer, another important sort of pillar of conservatism. Yeah.
Okay, so can I just answer?
Would you like me? No, I just have. I take that as an observation from Professor Day. Yes, the kind of social milieu. Of course, Gandhi's own the influence of his mother was a very strong influence on Gandhi. But I think the social milieu was one which really discouraged ostentation, and I think that also left a very deep impact on Gandhi. That to be frugal, to live to be simple. And I think, those were values which he did carry with him and which he sort of tried to adhere to. Too much has been made of his experiments with food. I think, there was something else also which he was looking for, or which, his diet, his food was perhaps not such an important part as has often been made out. I mean, he was not really obsessed with what he was eating and what he was not eating. In fact, it's actually interesting in this. I forget whether it's the London Diary or whether it is the. I don't know. It's that Guide to London, where he actually talks about how he was spoiled for choice on his outward journey on the ship. I mean, biographies of Gandhi keep on telling us that he was so anxious that he will not adhere to his sort of diet, but on the ship itself he has such a great variety, and he's so critical of those people who are very finicky and wouldn't eat something like cheese.
Interesting. Okay, I'll be very quick because I'm aware. Thank you so much. Very amazing questions and engagement, particularly as I'm just starting out on this project. This is not the finished thing, though Savarkar is kind of done, let's put it like this. But yes, I mean, I do see that the core debate I'm going to be reconstructing is between Rajaji and Munshi. This is the debate that unfolds precisely that they both are actually conservative, both are in a way but they differ entirely on the question of secularism itself. So that's an extremely well taken point, and I'm aware of it. But today I just wanted to talk about actually just Savarkar, because I think it just makes the case a bit more boldly, let's put it like that, and rather than working, rather than any of this, those figures. I really like this question on prognostics as not easily fensible to just the people I have written, but that these, that even academic historians have been involved in certain kind of political projects. Now we know the criticism of so-called sort of Aligarh historians for writing the prehistory of secularism into the Mughal state, right? Those sorts of problems that have existed. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that historians are free of their own political commitments, but the question is academic historians are generally, in general, even if they're writing for the future, that they want future generations to read it, they are not interested in capturing the future. Whereas the prognostic form is a futuristic form of historical telling. That's all I'm saying. And in that sense, this is precisely why I picked up Savarkar as a kind of critical example, because he's actually using that to talk about the conditions of possibility of Hindutva. So the reason why he is, say, different from R.C. Dutt, or he is different from even Nehru, in that sense, that in a way Nehru and all these other guys are prosecuting history as a lawyer's discourse. They're saying this is the proof that empire is bad to us, or this is the proof India will have, as it were, a nationality out of diversity. Savarkar is not doing that. Savarkar is actually, it's a kind of almost a futuristic utopian account. And actually this was slightly, it was slightly provoked. I wouldn't have said so much today on it. It was slightly provoked by some of the discussions yesterday, which forced me to say this today, and which is in a way now to just be very casual. I don't think academic historians should really interfere in the debate around the Hindu golden past. We will never win that. And not just win that, it's also a different set of argumentation, right? I mean, it's a different, that's all I'm saying, that, in a way, it was motivated by yesterday. It's not a deep concern of mine, but I'm unlikely to ever sign a petition against X or Y. That's all I'm saying, right? Because I think I understand that these are incredibly different discourses and finally to you, I completely agree that, of course, as I was being not simply provocative, but I have a deeper claim why I'm saying 1905. Though, of course, you can build a genealogy to the past. It's really the question of violence as form of sovereignty that becomes salient only after 1905. Okay? So the question that prior to that, you think about, you have very few reckonings. You have obviously reckonings with historicism, you have reckonings with empire, you have, reckonings with certainly social life. I mean, social life is the big theme in the 19th century. But the question of who gets to kill, who gets to die, the question of sovereignty in that sense is only a real question from 1905 onwards. So I'll just leave it there, because though I think that how can I dispute? I mean, there's Bhudev, there is, there is so many people who are writing in that trope. But I'm just interested in a kind of more the modern Republican sovereign project, so that's the reason I hold on to that date. And whether it's Charu or whether you will all have to forgive me, because I am not writing a social history of political ideas. I am actually trying to reconstruct these figures as political thinkers. So it will, I take sociology as, I use it, but I can't do more with it. Thank you. Yes, very quickly on the Hindu crown. I can only urge you to read a forthcoming PhD dissertation, which is being supervised by me. I can't take credit on it. It's by a remarkable young woman called Luna Sebastian, who is looking at German and Indian ideas in the interwar period. So I will just point to that, but my forthcoming book has a discussion on Savarkar's ideas of sovereignty. Okay, so that's I'll leave it there.
Well, I've been asked to say that we now have a 10-minute break, and so please be back in 10 minutes. But before you leave, please join me in thanking our three speakers for a truly marvelous panel.